I'm Alan Levine, the director of the Political Theory Institute, and just before I talk about this panel, if you take out your program, inside the back cover, I'd just like to draw your attention to a few upcoming events. We've got two events coming up. Is gay marriage good for America? That will be a debate on Tuesday, April 16th, and a human right to sexual satisfaction, question mark. That's a presentation on Thursday, April 25th. I made my joke about that earlier. You fill in your own joke now. And inside the back cover, we have an essay contest with a $500 cash prize for the best undergraduate essay on classical liberalism. So look at the specs here. You can go to our website for more information, but it's you have to submit that by Friday, April 19th, so 2 weeks from today. This could be something you wrote for a class, something else, whatever you want to do. And then finally, I hope that many of you might have given your email on the way in to get on our email list, but also like us on Facebook. We have a recently created Facebook page, and so you'll get our updates about all our different activities. Okay, so this is our final panel. We have been going, in some sense, in the direction of more political to more philosophical. This morning's panel was on inequality in America, very empirically as well as philosophically based, that conversation. Then we had, in the afternoon, the second panel was on what policymakers needed to know about the great political economists. And now we turn to a directly moral question: is capitalism moral? So I won't go into any of that myself. I'll let our speakers do that, and I will introduce them briefly in the order in which they'll be speaking. First, Lauren Lamosky is the Corey Professor of Political Philosophy, Policy and Law, and Director of the Political Philosophy, Policy and Law program at the University of Virginia. He's best known for his work in moral and political philosophy, and his book, Persons, Rights, and the Moral Community, won the 1991 Machette Prize. And then Jeff Ryman is the William Fraser McDowell Professor of Philosophy at American University, and he runs a conference in the fall with a pretty similar format to this one, and which I borrowed heavily in conceiving this. Ryman has authored 7 books and more than 100 articles in journals and anthologies. His most recent book is As Free and as Just as Possible: The Theory of Marxian Liberalism. In 2012, his book, The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison: Ideology, Class, and Criminal Justice, came out in its 10th edition. And then our final speaker will be Brandon Turner. And Brandon is currently, for this academic year that's coming to an all-too-fast close, is the postdoctoral fellow here at the Political Theory Institute in American University. And he is currently on leave from Clemson University, where he is assistant professor of political science and in a joint appointment with the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. So please join me in welcoming first Lauren Lamosky. And I'll just say our speakers will talk for 15 or 20 minutes each, then talk to each other, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
Thank you. It's very good to be back. And I say back because some of you were here for the opening session. I really performed poorly. And Ellen said, look, Lamosky, we'll give you a second chance. Come back after lunch, maybe you can do better. And I will try, but I don't think I will, because I think I'm being set up. This sounds to me like the kind of question that we call a softball. Is capitalism moral? And the answers to it seem to me too obvious. So I'm going to try to be brief. I'm not good at that. And let the others jump. And then maybe I'll get the point of this and be able to respond better. But maybe it's a trick question because, of course, capitalism isn't the sort of thing that can be moral or immoral. People can. Right? Some are saints, some are evil. And those who engage in capitalist activities include both. But that's true, but that's probably true of those who engage in professional sports, those who work at universities, those who are in Congress. No, I've gone too far with that one. But you get the point here. But I'm going to choose to interpret this as whether individual involvement in systems of free exchange should be applauded morally or be decried. And I say free exchange here because, again, for those who were here for the first session, Professor Levine indicated some dislike of the term capitalism for reasons that I tend to share. It's not a very good term. It's a system, presumably, in which productive activity involves the amassing of capital to enhance quantities. Well, in this sense, North Korea is a capitalist country. Indeed, about the only thing they produce there are capital goods. Consumption, not much fun. So if we're stuck with it because we need a one-word term that corresponds with socialism, we have capitalism. Okay, but basically what we're talking about, our system is a system of diverse producers and consumers, and that means all of us, by the way, because we all produce and consume. Even tenured professors produce, although one does have to extend the notion to, in a charitable sort of way there. But they do so, moreover, in ways that are not dictated from above, from the commanding heights, by the four-star general, by the economic czar, but in terms of their own pursuit of opportunities in which they make decisions. Some of these are good ones, some bad decisions, and they engage in free activity one with another, sort of in the way we do not just in this regard, but in associating with our friends, producing families, and so on. Is this morally commendable? Of course it is. I'm sure that because we have very subtle philosophers here, somebody is going to see something not quite right about this, but I think you're going to really have to work at it. This sort of enjoyment of liberty done on a level of individual choice, this is something pretty neat to have. It's attained relatively recently in human experience. If you've gone to see the Lincoln movie, you will see that one, certainly not the only, climactic event in the Lincoln presidency, and that's not quite living memory, but not so far back, is in terms of the decision what to do about slavery and how to institutionalize its abolition. And so, well, aside from our lamentable proclivities to throw people in prison to an outrageous extent, and by our proclivities to treat would-be immigrants with dreadful coercive means, we've certainly advanced in this regard of entertaining voluntary, mutual cooperative activity among individuals. So that's a good thing. So I take that to be a pretty easy one, but maybe what's meant by is capitalism moral is the question in a system of free exchange, all of the United States. And let's take the United States as paradigm example here, because the critics also do. Question could be, when people engage in this sort of interaction with each other, are the results that they produce, are these results things that we ought to welcome, or should we decry these? That it just turns out in a bad way. So we touched on this briefly in the opening panel on equality and inequality, and it turns out that there's more inequality in the United States measured, these technical ways, Gini coefficients, and so more here than in France. So is this bad? Is it good? Second, it can also be pointed out, and our previous panel talked a good bit about this, that sometimes the economy comes to grinding halts, goes in reverse. 1929 is a long time ago. 2008, not so much. I'm going to guess even freshmen can recall some of this. And there were comments at that time, this is the end of, well, usually they say Anglo-American capitalism, or something, laissez-faire capitalism. These are usually French and German continental people saying that, which is why, and I know this shows, I'm not a very nice person, but I can't help but enjoying all the turmoil of the European Union in the top six. And these guys have said, look how Americans, they screwed it up. When little Cyprus is almost sending them into oblivion, how can you not enjoy that? No, I take that back. I can't enjoy. But, so here's the question. A system that has such bad results, sometimes, shouldn't we say that's immoral, that's not choice-worthy? Well, I just, and again, I think this is where probably I'm missing the trick here. Is capitalism a bad system? Well, yes, except compared to all the others that have been tried from time to time. As Winston Churchill almost once said, few of us here are old enough to remember a time when there was serious debate, serious debate, as to whether communism was the wave of the future. We had Che Guevara posters on our walls, and things of that sort. Or whether humane socialism is a more acceptable basis of economic production. And so I would say all those questions have been answered. They've been answered at the level of theory. They've been answered at the level of practice. Capitalism is the only game in town now. Again, with North Korea as an honorable exception, or maybe a little less than honorable. But the question is, of course, we should have capitalism. Any society that lacks capitalist structures is one that is suffering, full stop. The only question is what sort of capitalist institutions should we have? Should it be more like almost socialistic Scandinavia? That was a good question 40 years ago, when Scandinavia was quasi-socialistic. They have been undoing a welfare state of high taxation levels and such, and plumping up the motivations of enterprise activities. Maybe Sweden does things better than we do. In a lot of ways, they do. I said earlier that I think most places do the healthcare industry better than we do. All places do the incarceration industry better than we do. I'd be glad to talk about particulars in this regard, but note the question that it's not up there. The question we were given is capitalism moral. The answer is intrinsically yes, because it involves free exchange choices by various parties to it. And is it extrinsically choice-worthy because human lives go better in it than any alternative? The answer is yes to that. So I will say the only significant question remains is what sort of capitalist institutions? And here I'm just going to throw out my view, and I hope the other speakers will speak to it. Do we do better to, quote unquote, bring back regulation to the market? I would say, quote unquote, because if you really believe the people who tell you that capitalist society has been deregulated in the last 20 years, I would like to invite you to join the American University poker game tonight, because you will leave your money on the table. We are rife with regulation, and I want to suggest that for the most part, when you go beyond regulation of health and safety issues, and even some of those, what we find over and over again is that not only don't they quite do the job, but they're self-defeating. They bring less of the good for which they were instituted. Talked about Adam Smith in the last session in terms of the workings of the invisible hand, the ironies of human sociality, and I think Smith would have known exactly what's going on here. But if you don't want to take my word for it, take a look, a serious look, at the regulated free exchange systems of the European Union, of countries that are so solicitous of labor, of the old, of gender roles, of social conditions of workers. You are looking at societies which I suspect, maybe I'm wrong, hope I'm wrong, I suspect to a large extent are in terminal decline. I think Europe has peaked, as did I back in the days of the Rolling Stones, which is why I was hoping to get invited back to the right to sexual satisfaction, because I can actually sing. I can't get no satisfaction, but be that as it may, I want to suggest to you that sure, economic activity isn't pretty, and that trying to make it prettier might succeed in some cases, no guarantee, more likely to screw things up worse. But we can debate, I think we ought to debate the fine points of this, but in terms of the overall question here, again, slam dunk, no realistic alternative to capitalistic institutions. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't need that. I wouldn't mind a light, though.
You can close that.
Yeah, is there a light here? Oh, that's nothing. That's better. Okay. I'm very happy to be here. I thank Alan for inviting me and for organizing this thing. And as he hinted, I have some sense of what goes into organizing this sort of thing. And so I commend him also in a personal way. I want to start by saying that since Lauren had his second chance, and I'm just here for my first chance, well, that means I should be listened to with a little more tolerance, right? I mean, right? I'm the new guy in town. I am a rookie here in this conference, and so, you should give me a little bit of extra rope. You'll be happy to know that there are many things that I agree with that Lauren said. For example, I think that as a matter of historical fact, there is no alternative game to capitalism. I will argue that there are some important immoral features or consequences of capitalism. I take this question pretty much the same way that Lauren did. That's to say, it's a question about the features of free exchanges between buyers and sellers of products and of labor. And it's also a question of the consequences. What does capitalism lead to, and so on. And that's what I'm going to address. In any event, to the question, is capitalism moral, I will answer with a resounding yes and no. Okay, this may surprise you a little bit. It was actually Karl Marx who taught me to admire capitalism. Actually, I also learned from Marx to fear socialism, but that's a story for another day. I don't have time to talk about that. But that's all part of my coming to the conclusion that there's no game in town but capitalism. In any event, it's important to notice that once you take away the the socialist or communist part of Marx, there are a lot of very strong arguments for capitalism. You see it in the Communist Manifesto, for example. There's great praise for the enormous, unprecedented productivity that capitalism brings about. And later on in Capital, Marx links growth in material productivity with growth in people's freedom. And, I accept that. I think that's right. After all, just about everything we choose to do freely requires some material goods. Okay, I mean, and I say that as a philosopher who mostly just thinks in my head, but, I need clothes to do that. I need a bed. I need a pen, pencil sometimes. I need a computer, and so on and so forth. And if I want to go someplace, I need a car or an airplane. In any event, so this is, I think, extremely important. And I think it's also important that Marx, for example, while Marx thought that the capitalism that he saw around him produced alienated workers, he didn't really, and one-sided workers, de-skilled workers, the sort of breaking the skills down in the assembly line, kind of a Charlie Chaplin type thing that you might have come across. Marx saw that advanced capitalism produced the reverse effect, that this you can find in Capital, that it called for workers who are much more all-sided, all-rounded, and autonomous. In my view, these are the workers who brought Soviet communism down. The command economy simply could not function with those kinds of workers, but again, that's another story as well. In any event, the crucial thing here is that capitalism produces enormous growth in material productivity, and that's a morally good thing, okay? There are lots of signs of it. I'll give you just two that sort of are, life expectancy around the globe has doubled in the last century. That's just enormous. There's nothing like that in historical precedent. And here's another thing. This is a small thing, but I think it's very typical and very revealing. This is a US government statistic. In 2007, 82% of Americans below the poverty line had air conditioning. Now, you know, think about poor people during the Depression, which was not really that long ago, or even say 40 or 50 years ago. This kind of thing was not true. And you can imagine these people also have large screen TVs. There's more, everybody has a refrigerator. Everybody has a refrigerator. 99.99% of households have refrigerators, okay? Just about everybody has a microwave, okay? Hard as it is, this is not your grandfather's poverty, okay? And that's because of this rise in the material standard of living, and I regard that as a very important and very good, morally good consequence of capitalism. Another very good quality of capitalism, or consequence of capitalism, is this. Capitalism tends to give people incentives to hire employees based on their performance rather than on their race or religion. And this has the effect of encouraging people to believe that they are entitled to equal treatment and to insist on it. Okay? So the big successful movements for anti-discrimination movements from groups like women and blacks and so on, more recently gays, who have been subject to discrimination, have happened almost uniquely in the capitalist countries. I think, for example, that the recent controversies about rape in India, the big demonstrations that followed this terrible rape that took place in New Delhi, this is a result of the growth of capitalism. The last 2 decades, you've seen India went away from the socialist ideology of Nehru and started introducing free market reforms, and the result has been an enormous growth in the middle class, an enormous growth in personal wealth, and so on, and many of the things that you would expect. And lo and behold, you have people out on the street protesting rape, the treatment of rapists by the state, and protesting in a way that the government can't ignore. Okay? Well, I mean, why did this happen? Women have been mistreated in India for centuries. Okay? This isn't a new thing. Okay? It didn't recently get worse. If anything, it got better, okay? Although it's still terrible. Okay? Well, I attribute this to capitalism. That's the good news. The bad news is that capitalism also has immoral consequences. Okay? So I agree with Lauren that our issue is really what kind of capitalism do you want? And I'm going to say we want a capitalism that has some redistributive function. Okay? I think that's going to be the main thing that I think there's probably other environmental limitations we'd like to put on it, but I'm not going to get into that. Okay? But I think that's another area where capitalism doesn't do all that good if left on its own. Okay? So one thing about capitalism that leads to immoral consequences is that it creates inequality. Okay? It's a competitive system, after all. There can't only be winners. Okay? There's got to be losers, and of course there are losers. Okay? Now, let's be clear, it's not necessarily a bad thing if people lose out because of their own bad judgments, you know, maybe that's okay, okay? But here's the thing. People don't just lose out by their bad judgments. Their children lose out. Okay? They're innocent children who made no bad judgments, who could not make any bad judgments. They lose out as well if their parents, for whatever reason, become poor or become less well off or lose their job, okay? Now, that simply can't be fair. Okay? You can say that it's fair that a person who makes a stupid decision pays for it. You can't say it's fair that his child pays for it, that his child starts off significantly disadvantaged compared to the children who were smart enough to be born to people who had good luck in the market or made wise decisions or were successful. Okay? Now, that's a very, very important fact about capitalism, and I'm going to come back to it, okay? If you, in this environment, decided to study to become a travel agent, a photo processor, okay? A hard copy bookseller, okay? Well, you may deserve to fail for making a stupid decision. But your innocent children do not deserve to have a starting point that's significantly worse than other people who made better decisions. Okay? They can't possibly, that cannot possibly be fair. They can't possibly deserve that. And it affects everything. It affects the kind of schools they go to. It affects their own possibilities. We can predict all too easily an adult's social economic class from his childhood class, from the class into which he is born. Okay? And that means that people are being affected in negative ways for reasons beyond their control, and that ain't moral. Okay? Now, to my mind, these kinds of considerations show the basis of the different assessments of capitalism made by liberals like John Rawls and me, and those made by libertarians like Robert Nozick and Jan Narveson, and I suspect by Lauren. Libertarians tend to think that as long as transactions are free of force and fraud, they are fair and their consequences are just. Liberals, on the other hand, tend to believe that even if economic transactions are fair and free, they can end up producing large inequalities that are unjust to later economic exchangers. So, for example, Rawls wrote in his last book, Justice is Fairness, a Restatement, the accumulated results of many separate and seemingly fair agreements entered into by individuals and associations are likely over an extended period to undermine the background conditions required for free and fair agreements. Very considerable wealth and property may accumulate in a few hands. Okay? And these concentrations are likely to undermine fair equality of opportunity, the fair value of the political liberties, and so on. That's a quote from Rawls. Now, this concentration of wealth that Rawls talks about that may happen has happened. It's real and it's persistent. In 2007, the top 10% of American households held 71.5% of American wealth. Okay? 10% of American families, 71.5%, right? Which means 90% of American families had 28.5% to divide between them. Okay? At no time since the colonial era has a majority of Americans owned more than 10% of American wealth. Okay? So much for mobility, for the American dream, and so on. Okay? These are serious questions. Now, and the point is, however freely and fairly this wealth has been gained, okay, it's a fact that the children of the well-off have greater opportunities to be well-off themselves than the children of less well-off people. Okay? They go to better schools. Okay? They have more time to study. They don't have to hold jobs. Okay? They have nicer and quieter places to do their studying. Okay? They're not hearing gunshots all the time or living in fear and so on. Okay? And of course, they benefit from their parents' contacts, none of which is available to less well-off people. Okay? And, you know, even middle-class people, they're better off than the poor, but they're not getting nearly that kind of thing from that the rich are. You know, I spoke to a cousin of mine. One of their sons has a reading disability. Okay? They put him in one of the best schools for learning disabled. I don't know if you've heard, it's called the Kingsbury Lab School. It's one of the best in the country, okay? $50,000 a year. $50,000 a year, okay? And they're paying, right? Not everybody can pay that, okay? So that means you can't send your kid to that if you can't pay for it. Well, again, what did those kids do to deserve that difference in their fate? That can't be just. That can't be right. Okay? Okay. And this is only the beginning. When Rawls says that these concentrations undermine fair equality, the fair value of political liberties, this is technical language in his system. What it means is that the wealthy have greater political influence, greater influence on the outcome of political decisions, greater influence on politicians than the less well off. Okay? You know, a senator has to spend most of his working time accumulating money to pay for fabulously expensive campaigns. And you think that if he gets big donors to give him millions of dollars, he's not going to listen when they whisper in his ear about how they feel about some particular law? Okay. There goes one person, one vote. Okay. Political influence is dramatically, and notice this is a consequence. I'm not even saying that the inequality itself is so bad, but think of the things that it leads to. Okay? That's what's often where it's the worst. Okay? Okay. Right? It violates democratic principle that individuals should have roughly equal influence on political outcomes. Okay? Great wealth, great inequality undermines that principle. Likewise, large inequalities of wealth undermine equality before the law. Wealthy people get better legal care and they do better in courts. Funny. Right? Tried for murder in 1995, the one-time football star O.J. Simpson brought to court a team of 7 high-priced lawyers, including stars like F. Lee Bailey and Alan Dershowitz, and 2 additional lawyers, okay, that's 9 now, whose job was just to try to discredit the prosecution's DNA evidence. Lo and behold, he was found innocent. Okay. Meanwhile, you've got poor people who go to a criminal murder case with an underpaid, overworked public defender. And we've had the Supreme Court accept the convictions in capital murder cases, right? That's a case for which you stand vulnerable to the death penalty. Cases where the defender, the public defender, and public defenders are often good and experienced lawyers, don't get me wrong. But when they have hundreds of cases, when they are paid pittance so they can barely put an hour's time into it, no matter how good they are, they can't produce miracles. And so the Supreme Court has approved, accepted decisions, convictions in capital cases where the defender spent minutes with his defendant. And in one notorious case where the public defender fell asleep in court. Okay? I'm sure that F. Lee Bailey did not fall asleep during O.J. Simpson's trial. Okay? Now notice, well, this, I just want to say, you know, everybody says there are no rich men on death row. Right? Well, this is why. Okay? This is why. You can usually buy your way out. Note, and this is very important for my difference with libertarians, all of these things result even if the system is working fairly and freely, just the way it's supposed to according to the textbook. Okay? This is not about cheating. Okay? Now, we get to the real world, which, you know, as a philosopher, I keep my distance from. You know, I break out in a rash when I get too close to reality, but, you know, it's unavoidable sometimes. In the real world, there are other problems. Okay? Inequality creates differences in bargaining power. The richer you are, the longer you can hold out for favorable terms. The poorer you are, the quicker you have to give in to unfavorable terms. So that inequality undermines the so-called fairness of the bargaining process itself and leads to greater inequality over time. Okay? And of course, if there is racial or gender or age or sexual orientation discrimination in your society, if that's the case, well, yeah, that's going to work itself through the market. and it's going to affect your bargaining position. If because of discrimination, because of you're a woman, and most people see you as doing nurturative things, being a teacher or a nurse, okay, not a rocket scientist, although if you read there was an obituary just the other day about a woman who made a breakthrough in rocket science, you know, but of course what was interesting about this was how rare it is, okay? How unusual it is. Okay? So if you are dealing with people who, just in the back of their heads, have that kind of assumption, you have less alternatives to choose from, and therefore you're in a weaker bargaining position than a comparable man. And the same goes for gender, for racial discrimination, and sexual orientation, and so on. Okay? Now, from this, it follows that there's nothing sacrosanct or inherently just about free world, real world, free market transactions. Okay? They're efficient. It's good, right? It works to make the market more efficient, That contributes to this ability of the capitalist system to raise the material standard of living, which I'm all for, okay? Even functioning ideally, market transactions have immoral consequences, and of course in the real world there are yet other negative consequences that get funneled through or work their way through the market, okay? Because of these facts, I think that it is morally required to redistribute income from what results from free exchanges to something more just. Okay? This is the kind of institutional capitalism that I want, responding to Lauren's question. Okay? The standard of distributive justice that I favor is Rawls's difference principle. It holds that inequality is just insofar it is the least necessary to maximize the shares of everyone in society, starting with the worst off people. Though I don't have time here to spell out the argument, I think there is a persuasive argument for this. Okay? I think it can be shown that it's what's in everyone's interest when everyone must agree, okay? And that that's the right way to pose the question because everyone is affected by it. Okay? If you earn money, it's basically a claim on everybody else's labor. And so there are reasons why that's the proper forum or structure for answering the question. Okay? Note that this principle places greater value on raising people's absolute standard of living and lesser value on reducing relative inequality. In other words, inequality is tolerated as a means to maximize people's absolute shares. Okay? So it takes advantage of that thing which I started by saying I think is a very morally positive thing about capitalism. Finally, because there's nothing sacrosanct or inherently just about real-world free transactions, one ought not to view applying the difference principle as a kind of Robin Hood thing, stealing from the rich to give to the poor, nor is it charity. This is very important, and many philosophers overlook it. Right? They talk about how the difference principle imposes sacrifices on the well-off. The point is, if the difference principle is true, that's to say, if it truly spells out the requirements for distributive justice, then anyone who has more than the difference principle would have allotted him has no right to that. Okay? So that when you redistribute, because you believe that the difference principle spells out the just economic distribution, you are only taking from people what they do not have a right to. Okay? It's like stolen goods. Okay? Or like stolen goods that come to you indirectly. You know, somebody who stole a house sells it to you, and then you find yourself, having done nothing bad, owning somebody else's property. Well, that's just too bad. Okay? I'm sorry about that. But in a certain sense, the same logic applies, and it means that those who are getting the benefits are getting what was always rightly theirs. And I just want to close by pointing out that this feature of distributive justice was already noticed by Kant in the 18th century. Okay? He says in his lectures in ethics, which are delivered over a course of several years, starting around 1775, okay? So around the time of the American Revolution. He writes this: although we may be entirely within our rights, according to the laws of the land, we may nevertheless be participating in general injustice. And in giving to an unfortunate man we do not give him a gratuity. Right? We think we're giving charity, but it's not really charity. But we are only helping to return to him that of which the general injustice of our system has deprived him. Now, I think that since I believe in the difference principle as the principle of justice, I think that the poor are owed something, the rich are holding some things that they don't have a right to, and we're not doing charity. We are helping the poor have the things which they ought to have had from the beginning were our society just. Thanks a lot for listening.
All right, thanks everyone. I think I'm the last to go today. So
Excuse me there, Brandon. I all these material goods.
yeah.
Do you have a right to that?
Probably not.
And thanks to Alan for hosting me not only
You can have these are for you.
not only today for the conference, but for the academic year. So I've very much enjoyed my time in the Political Theory Institute, and I assume Alan and the Institute will continue having the kind of success that they've had thus far. So in getting the question, is capitalism moral? Right, I thought about it for a while, and then right, there's always, in a stack of undergraduate papers, there's always a couple that sort of try to get clever and say something like, well, I question the question itself. What does capitalism even mean, right? What does the word "is" mean? Something like that. So this is the last resort of people under pressure to put something together, and so this is that to which I have resorted. So I do wonder about the question whether we can ask whether capitalism is moral, and we've had some sort of informal discussion over the course of the day over what we mean when we say capitalism. Are we talking about markets? Are we talking about something like the political economic ideology that developed in the 19th and 20th centuries that we refer to as free market capitalism or laissez-faire capitalism or even libertarianism? For a while, and I'd say really for the last 100 years, it seemed like this was a question you could ask. It seemed like the market and the state were entities that could be in some meaningful way disentangled from one another. So, if you read somebody like Milton Friedman, but in particular if you read someone like Murray Rothbard or even Mises, right? You get the impression that the state is a thing that's placed on top of the market, right? The state is something that develops independently of. The state is something alien to some natural relations, and I hope I'm not doing too much violence to this view. This isn't a view that's particular to 20th century libertarians. This is also the view, the kind of rudimentary view put forward in the sort of the early years of what we now refer to as classical liberalism, right? So if you read Locke's second treatise, right, in Locke, there's this idea that the state is a means that we use to realize our ends which are developed in whatever way before or outside of the relationships of the state. And so for a very long time, right, I mean, and I would say something like libertarianism, small L libertarianism as an ideology or as a theory developed in this intellectual atmosphere, and in particular during the Cold War, right, when we felt like we could talk, and I say we, I'm like 30, so I don't know, my parents or something like that, right, could talk about, on the one hand, capitalism as a distinct entity versus communism or socialism, when we could talk about something like individualism versus collectivism, right, these were distinct ideas, that we could talk about the market and market relations over and against the state and state relations. And in a lot of, in the kind of the historical backdrop of this was because we could talk about, right, the United States and Russia, right, or the USSR to be more accurate. And in a lot of ways, we actually have these sort of gross husks of this I think, ideological tendency today. And so on the right, and I think libertarians have actually contributed in some ways to the decline of the intellectual right. And on the right, if you turn on Fox News, even the religious right, I mean, now holds the market and these kind of natural market relations to be something that exists outside the state, something that the state only screws up. Right, and so, right, for every wrong, there's another wrong. On the other side, you have MSNBC, right? You have these ads on TV with like Rachel Maddow. I mean, if you've seen this standing in front of the Hoover Dam, and so against, and she's talking about just how freaking great government is, right? I mean, just so the kind of response to anti-government has incredibly been just pro-government. These kind of very sort of facile views, these kind of ghosts of these arguments we had in the middle of the 20th century. But this wasn't always the case. We didn't usually talk about the market and the state as two distinct entities, or capitalism or free markets, and the sort of political apparatus that sat on top of it. We didn't talk of it in these in these ways. So in the 18th century, for those of, and I see some of my students here, we use this phrase, or they use this phrase, commercial society, or even in Hume's phrase, civilization, right? They had a much more holistic approach to these questions, right? So the system of early capitalism, industrialism, these kind of things, right? The idea of commercial society, right, went with a certain conception of what the purpose of the state was, of what the state looked like, right? It also went with a certain conception of right, Hume's got these nice essays talking about the different sorts of arts, right, the mechanical arts, the fine arts, and that in some way these are all sort of linked together, right? So you get the kind of art that's befitting a capitalist economy, you get the kind of political institutions that befit a capitalist economy, you get the kind of habits, right, and mores that befit a capitalist economy, and it's not just a one-way street, right? So the market develops with politics, right? Exchange develops with property rights. You get, in other words, you get this sort of impression, right? So commercial society was not just some natural market system that we've discovered, something like that, right? Commercial society had to do with a stage of society, a big picture kind of civilizational question. Now we're going to live like this, right? And in the 19th century, you saw the same thing. So, of course, ironically, we've referenced Marx several times as the kind of originator of this idea of capitalism. And yet, right, for Marx, capitalism or markets, these were indistinguishable from, well, not entirely indistinguishable, but for the most part indistinguishable from sort of cultural and political institutions that they came embedded with, right? So your conceptions of morality itself, right, are in some way not just influenced by, but conditioned by the capitalistic system in which you live. And of course, in some ways there's an irony here in the sense that in the 18th and 19th centuries, Hume, Mandeville, Marx, these guys were critiquing the sort of social contract theorizing, the kind of rationalistic approach to political questions that you find in somebody like Locke and Rousseau, and which is precisely the kind of theorizing that flourished in the 20th century, right? And so in this case, I'm thinking of Rothbard, even Rand and Nozick on the right, and then Rawls on the left. And so if I were to offer one thing, I guess, it would be that we need to move back to this more holistic understanding of what capitalism is, right? We need to move away from discussion about big government and big business and more of a comprehensive understanding of how these two go together, how they are unintertwinable. So if we're going to ask this question, is capitalism moral, I think we need to look at the big picture, right? I mean, there's a certain sense, and I think it's a very real sense, in which capitalism simply is, right? It's a kind of, it's an always already. It conditions us from the time we emerge from the womb. Weber said it confronts us like an iron cage, right? That the mentality of capitalism is something from which we cannot escape. And so I think as a rule, criticisms of capitalism tend to come, or when critiques of capitalism or questions of morality in capitalism tend to come in two forms. They come either as kind of far more general, right, to rail against capitalism is to rail against the human condition itself or life itself. So I was struck actually by the earlier talk on Keynes actually using this phrase apparently, I don't know if it was direct quotation, right, but the problem with capitalism is, one of the problems with capitalism is, right, this question of the love of money, right, that the love of money is evil. Well, I mean, talk about a timeless question, right? I mean, it wasn't just when we became capitalists that people started loving money. I mean, the phrase love of money is obviously a biblical phrase, right? This has always kind of been a problem. So I think a lot of times we mistake, again, sort of timeless critiques of the human condition for something more specific to capitalism itself. So they either shoot far too wide, or I think they shoot far too narrowly. So in other words, questions about inequality, I think, while extremely important, and in particular important to certain classes that have been underserved, I think these questions about inequality actually suggest just how deeply the question of is capitalism moral or not, these have been settled. Right? I think our questions about economic inequality and other sorts of questions, right, questions that we typically attribute to the problems with capitalism, actually demonstrate the extent to which our moral sensibilities have evolved over time within the capitalist sort of civilizational progress. So, in other words, right, we have capitalist problems, right, first world problems that aren't problems elsewhere, and not that's not to diminish their importance at all, right, but things like sexual harassment and sexual assault, right, abuse of marginalized populations, environmental issues, gay, lesbian, bisexual issues, right? We didn't know these were issues 200 years ago. And it's, without question, it's an unqualified good that we're now identifying them and addressing them, right? But they're all sort of within the broader context, I think, of something like liberal capitalism. And it's actually, it reminds me of a point from the first chapter, the first part of the first chapter from The Wealth of Nations, where Smith compares the day laborer in England to a king of a savage nation, an African nation or something. And we usually take that as Smith's sort of a rising tide lifts all boats idea, right? So the idea is that, you know, the day laborer in England in a commercial society has more stuff than the king, right, the very top of the savage society. And yeah, I think the point is actually, I think he's making a slightly more subtle point, right? So, in other words, the day laborer, right, exists in a society in which inequality is actually smaller than in the savage society. So, in other words, if you're a king in a savage economy, right, you have, and he actually uses this phrase, right, you have absolute power over those around you. Right, the inequality between the king and in a savage nation in a peon, right, is absolute. Right, it's perfect inequality. Whereas the difference between the day laborer and the wealthiest member of a commercial society is far, far, far smaller. Right, and seemingly getting smaller all the time. I think earlier today, the PowerPoint, I think they were going to make that point about right, private jet versus planes, right? Everyone can still get where they're going. It might be different kinds of luxury, but in terms of capabilities, right, there's far less inequality, I think, within capitalist societies than outside them. So in other words, I think the question of is capitalism moral is in one sense sort of unanswerable, but I do think I think we have some approaches, some ways of asking the question, and I think the very crude but I think important way of asking is, right, when and where would you want to live, right? If you could be randomly placed in a particular society across space and time, right? How many people in here would like to be placed, say, 500 years ago? Nobody. How many people would want to be placed like 25 years ago? So, okay, sometime not in the 70s. Sometime before like the proliferation of cheap recreational drugs.
So unfair.
And I think a lot of the waffling that people have on this question, I think in a lot of ways this is confined, and nothing against Dr. Lemask, I think this is confined to men. I think if you ask most women whether they'd rather live today or 25 years ago or even 50 years ago, I think the answer is far clearer. I think if you asked a woman in rural China whether they'd rather live today or 25 or 50 years ago, I think the answer is far clearer. And so why is this? Why do we have, and actually I think if you could be placed in the future, I think some people would actually even prefer to be placed in the future, which is a kind of a crazy thing to think about. So why is that? I think on the one hand, right, I think there's a very obvious thing that almost everyone today has touched on, which is this utilitarian calculus, right? We're just better off, and we mean better off in all the ways we're better. If we live longer, we have more things, life is just better now than it was previously. One thing that goes unnoticed in this conversation a lot, though, I think, is something like personal safety. So those of you who read Steven Pinker's book or seen one of the million interviews that Steven Pinker did when he released his last book, right? The statistics in terms of homicide rates, and in particular sort of sexual crimes, rape in the family, and then also by strangers, I mean, it's mind-boggling, actually. The likelihood of being murdered like 500 years ago is I can't remember the exact statistic, but it blows the mind. The likelihood of being raped, something like 1 in 3 women, right, would be physically violated, full rape in the context of their life, in the course of their life. So I think safety, goes underrated. But I kind of want to offer one sort of thing to kind of, I don't know how much time I have left, but I want to offer one reason, right, maybe we're not totally comfortable with, but maybe one reason why we'd rather live in a capitalist rather than a non-capitalist society. By non-capitalist, I mean, I do think we have options here. There are other visions of what the world would look like, right? And I think going back actually and reading these old texts that I make my students read, going back and reading Mandeville and Rousseau and these kind of things, demonstrates that, I mean, there are, right, that in a very real way, the capitalist tradition, to the extent that it is a tradition, the capitalist mindset, is fundamentally different than, say, the traditional Christian worldview, the traditional Republican worldview, and then also something like the radical Marxist vision, which Dr. Ryman says he's skeptical of Marx's younger years, but I do think that it at least presents an alternative to capitalism. And I guess going back and seeing what the options were. So here's Mandeville saying, you know what's great about commercial society? What's great about it is that you'll be able to do all the things that you always wanted to do, right? What's great about commercial society is that you won't be held back by some of the old sort of moral strictures that bound you in the past, that your vices will be let loose to a certain extent. And I think this is the hardest case, I think, to make for capitalism, because there's a nice little conjuncture of common critiques. Right, so in other words, let me put it this way. We would like to be in capitalist societies, I think, if you think about this clearly, not just because there's more stuff in terms, so when you ask people, well, I like, so we often say things like refrigerators, so keeping food cold, providing for my kids, right, living in some comfort and ease and things like that. We rarely say, I want to live in capitalist societies because I want to be able to play as many video games as I want, because I want to spend 8 hours a day on Facebook, right? Because I want to literally drown myself in the luxuries of the commercial age, right? This is often seen less as something that capitalism has gotten right and more like something that it's gotten wrong. It's unleashed in us our materialist propensities. Another thing I don't think another kind of common critique of capitalist societies is that we tend to use others as means, right? We tend to have a dog-eat-dog approach to things. We tend to, right, and Facebook is a kind of good example, right? I mean, there's no real friendships on Facebook. There's only these kind of facile relationships. It's more of being, seeing and being seen, right? Very kind of superficial. We're using each other as a source of pleasure rather than a source of friendship or something like that. And yet again, I mean, I think to a certain extent, this can be viewed as one of the benefits of capitalism, right? That we have access to more people to use as means. So on the one hand, right, it's a question of comparative advantage. We get to use their smarts, we get to use their technical skills and things like that. But it also simply means that more people are available to us through communication devices, through lowering of traditional moral standards, right? The fact that women can walk the streets as much as they want. I mean, that kind of thing, right? So we're able to use other people as means far more than we ever have been before. Another thing you often hear about capitalism, or at least late-stage capitalism, is that it relentlessly overturns kind of traditional norms, right? It relentlessly overturns normative systems, right? So it has a corrosive effect. Corrosive effect on religion, corrosive effect on the family, corrosive effect on whatever institution or whatever virtue you feel particularly fond of. Capitalism probably has a corrosive effect on it in one way or another. And actually, there's this nice quote from the Communist Manifesto where Marx talks about capitalism as a revolutionary ideology. He writes, "It cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instrument of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. The need of a constantly expanding market for its product chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all nations, even the most barbarian, into civilization. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together." Right, capitalism has this confusing effect, this disorienting effect, right? It dislodges us from our previous sources of meaning. And this is the critique you see on the left in somebody like Michael Sandel, and on the right with the other New York Times columnist, Ross Douthat. I've never heard anyone with an authoritative way of pronouncing his name, if it's Douthat or Douthat. So in other words, I think there's something to be said for, I guess, the more subversive elements of capitalism, right? It's always the sinful elements, it's always the less savory elements of capitalism that we end up wanting the most. So if we think about the Cold War as a kind of a clash between individualism and collectivism, right, between capitalism and communism, right, but the Cold War was also about sex, drugs, and rock and roll on the one side. I don't know if you guys have ever heard that phrase before. Whatever communist Russia was producing at the time, presumably not sex, not drugs, and not rock and roll. And so in other words, I wonder if one of the strongest reasons we have for preferring now over previous times doesn't really have to do with providing for ourselves, providing for our family, safety, and these kind of things, but just the unfettered venting of our vices. And I think that's something to be said for it. So thanks.
I want to give the panelists a chance to respond to each other. If there's anything that anyone said that anyone wants to respond to.
Well, I'd like to thank these guys for confirming my suspicion. There really isn't any question about the morality of capitalism. You could have called the session, should we have more redistribution? And then there's a real disagreement, I think. You could have called it, are old people bad, which was his view. And frankly, I mostly agree with Brandon, as much as it pains me, but I think we should talk about redistribution, because that was a fair challenge. I think it has nothing to do with whether capitalism is admirable, except that it sort of endorses capitalism, right? If you don't have vibrant markets producing a lot of wealth, you're not going to redistribute well. So maybe we're more alike than unalike here, but I think there's a naivete, certainly in Rawls, when he talks about background conditions, but even in Professor Ryman, concerning how redistribution works. And it's to suppose that it goes from those who have more to those who have less, with few exceptions. I want to ask you guys if that's true, right? And so I'm going to mention a few programs. I want you to tell me whether you think unbalanced it takes from the wealthy toward the less wealthy or vice versa. Unemployment, insurance, money. Which way does it go? Come on, you're American, no, you're Miami students. Which way does it go? Who does it benefit? Oh, that's a softball one. Come on. The poor, you're right. What about Medicaid? The poor, you're right. What about mortgage interest deduction? Oh, geez, I forgot about that. What about What about health care? If employers pay health care, it's not taxable to you. Is that going to help the poor more or the rich more? What about farm price supports?
Very well.
Yeah, and ethanol subsidies and such. What about my University of Virginia? Is a state university. State universities pay subsidies so college kids' tuition is lower. Does that benefit the poor or the less poor? To the rich, yeah, because you guys maybe someday will get jobs and such and make a lot of. Look, I could keep going through this to pharmaceuticals policy, why we pay more for our drugs than any country in the world does, to this wonderful city, with its monument, the NEA, the Endowment for the Arts. Who do you think this redistributes to in terms of opera goers and such? The poor or the rich? So there are some things that actually redistribute on balance to the poor. Does it poorly? Our public schools do it real poorly. Our correctional justice, don't get me started on that. But by and large, the thing we know of this is if you can somehow keep the state out of it, keep it neutral, the poor are going to do better on average, and the rich will do less well in this regard. No surprise, there are a lot more K Street lobbyists who are doing stuff, with your legislators on behalf of the well-off than on behalf of these poor children he's talking about. You want those poor children to do better, for God's sakes, get them out of the Teachers Union, Department of Education established, maybe some hope for them. Send them to American University.
Can I say something? It seems to me that what Lauren has just said now is very interesting. I have very little disagreement with it, but I think it's totally irrelevant. I'm not calling... I'm not calling for continuing or expanding the contemporary so-called distributive institutions. Okay? I'm calling for truly redistributing from people who get more than they should to people who have less than they should. Okay? So I'm not for the mortgage deduction, although I benefited from my whole life. It's perfectly true that it does benefit the well-off, of course. Okay, that's true. Other things do benefit the poor. Okay? We have largely eliminated elderly poverty through a combination of Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid. Okay? We are in the process of getting to a point where an additional 30 million people who have been without insurance, often for financial reasons, will be covered. Okay? Maybe it's not the best way to do it, but it certainly wasn't good to have 30 million people uninsured, because we know they go to the doctor more rarely and they have higher death rates and so on. Okay? And that's a function of money. It's true that the public schools have done a very mixed job. I'm not a particular defendant of them. But how are you going to fix it? Well, the libertarian will usually say, let's have vouchers. Okay? Fine, I'm all for it. Where are you going to get the vouchers? Okay? You're not going to dig them up off the street. You're going to have taxes. Okay? You're going to have the state, right? Because it's going, it's poor people are going to need the vouchers. Where will they get it? Okay? So I'm not for the programs that have screwed up. Okay? I'm for the position that we should actually redistribute according to the difference principle from the better off to the less well off, and we should keep an eye on those institutions that are doing that and prevent the ones that are really funneling money to the middle class and the upper classes from doing it. I'm against the farm subsidy. I'm against a million corporate tax breaks that, you know, I don't think you need a deduction for your private jet. I don't have one for mine, and so on. But I don't think that what Professor Lamy said has touched my main claim about redistribution.
See, earlier he called me Lauren. Now that he's really engaged, I've become Professor Lamy.
I was just trying to show him a little bit of respect, having refuted everything he said.
Clearly. If we're going to agree that much, why don't we pick on Brandon?
Let's go. Let's go.
His vicious remarks about people 25 years ago.
Just unbearable, really. Unacceptable.
Yeah. You have a lot of good stuff. Your music, compared to our music, pretty poor.
I agree with this.
We had the Beatles.
We had the best rock and roll in history. That's right. Yeah, we had sex, drugs, and rock and roll before they became lethal.
We still have the Rolling Stones.
Yes, we do.
So he finally said something nice about old people.
Yeah.
Yep.
Brandon, do you want to say anything about the debate?
Honor your elders.
So it seems to me that there is a lot of, I guess, common ground on issues of basic concerns, right? So I don't think anyone here would say that society has no responsibility whatsoever to take care of the least well-off, or at least no one said that publicly, or here anyway. Maybe in private conversations amongst friends they would say that. But it seems to me though that this question of right, well, let's do redistribution correctly and not incorrectly, right? That there's a lot of, so for example, the development of public choice economics in the last 50 years has gone some way in demonstrating just how difficult this question is, right? And actually something from Richard's talk on Adam Smith. So Smith advocates something like public education, and yet the big part of that chapter, book 5, right, is on, I don't know if Richard took off, is on how difficult it is to actually get good schools, right? Because he says the schools have been designed not for the sake of the children, but rather for those who run them, right? For the sake of the administrators and for the teachers. So even as early as Adam Smith, right, you see this critique of institutions. We realize, we recognize the problems that we've employed the state to resolve, and yet at the same time we now have a pretty robust theory whose primary point is that it's very, very difficult to use the state in this way, right? So that no matter how you aim to redistribute, right, interest groups will always find a way of glomming on.
That's why I called Professor Ryman naive. If we just have good people adopting good policies, then things are fine. Well, yeah, but philosopher King said, probably doesn't work. And I think the public choice mention is apropos here. Yeah. We know how these things will be co-opted in practice.
But look, but remember that my pal Lauren also pointed out that some of these programs actually do help the poor. So the track record of the government is a mixed one. It's not totally negative. It's not totally impossible. So what we have to do is pick and choose, pick those kinds of things that work, eliminate those ones that don't. There are inherent problems in having government, okay? It has a lot to do with the fact that it's staffed by humans, okay? And we're going to have to deal with those problems. Naive. I think that anyone who thinks that we're actually ever going to have libertarianism is about as naive as you can be, because you would basically have just an economy and virtually no government. Well, that ain't going to happen. And if you have a little bit of government, then for the very same reasons that Lauren and even I distrust government, you're going to have people trying to co-opt it. And so, you know, what you're going to have to do, the only really way to deal with that is to somehow keep it open, keep it transparent, try to make sure that people have ways of fighting back against it and so on. You know, I don't think any of that's going to be fixed.
So would you support something like a negative income tax or a universal basic income, something like that? I mean, so in other words, a universal basic income, I mean, the basic idea is instead of, right, the government saying this is how the money's going to be spent, et cetera, we just say, listen, if you fall below a certain point, you get a lump sum, right? You spend it how you want to. If you want to blow it on drugs, you can blow it on drugs. Whatever you want to do, that's fine.
Why do you say blow it on drugs?
It has to do with this drug of choice.
It's more prejudice against our generation. I mean,
but I mean, but none, I guess in other words, it seems to me there's ways of satisfying both of the. So in other words, the desire for a smaller, simpler administrative state with a concern for the less well-off.
well, look, I'm not here to take a position on whether it should be a guaranteed minimum or negative income tax. You know, I'm frankly open to what works, okay? If that's a way of doing it, I would not tell people how to spend their money. That's for damn sure. On that, I agree quite a bit with libertarians. You know, I think, you know, you give people money and hope that they use it well. But, you know, the important point is that you correct the unfairness that they find themselves without money, okay? You correct the unfairness that they don't have the money to give better educational opportunities to their kids and so on, okay? You know, I don't think it's our job to somehow step in and make people virtuous. I'm not for that. I think if you make the shares equal, or you make the shares just, and you have fair opportunity and good education, then, you know, people make of that what they make of it. If they screw up, if they make foolish decisions, well.
And Lauren, you raised practical objections to what Jeff said. Do you have a problem in principle with what he's saying, or do you think the call for redistribution is just neither here nor there in the discussion about the nature of capitalism?
I think it is our job to make people virtuous. That is our job as professors, as parents, as the state's job. Are you kidding? I think my problem in principle is that we know a lot about how those who hold coercive authority over others tend to use it, and we know about the dangers of it. I don't expect the libertarian utopia to arrive anytime soon, but we ought to be thinking in the ways that Mr. Jefferson did, Federalist authors did, and so on, in terms of checks on coercive power.
So I now want to open it up to the audience. We have two microphones, one on each side down here in the front. The main thing that I've learned in this panel is that I ask bad questions. Let's see if you can do a better job.
Your question about the right to sexual satisfaction.
All right, so you guys look like you're having so much fun up there that I wanted to join in. Actually, I felt a little bit misled by this because you were supposed to talk about the future of capitalism, and I've been hearing a lot about capitalism as it was dreamt up by Adam Smith and sort of refined a little bit by Marx, and it seems like it's this iron cage now that we're stuck with, and you either have it or not, or you like it or not, or it's moral or not. And so I guess I'm going to pull an undergraduate stunt and refine the question. And I think a more interesting question is, how do you make capitalism more moral? How can you improve it? How can you change it to reflect the markets of today, the business of today, where an iron steel mill owned by a capitalist is no longer the means of production, the most important thing in our society, but human capital, where a London schoolboy can make a $14 million app and come up with that from his own human capital. There's all sorts of talk in Davos about conscious capitalism. And so what can you do to change this theory and break out of this iron cage and make capitalism more moral? That seems like a more interesting discussion.
Jeff,
Well, I mean, I don't actually recognize your description of the discussion, because I don't think anybody was talking about the capitalism being either moral or not, or good or not. I think I certainly was talking about its moral parts and its ways it can be more moral. And I also made a suggestion about how it could be made moral by making the distribution fair. You know, in addition to that, I think it would be wise to encourage investment in human capital. Okay? I don't think we can have a society in which you can guarantee that everybody will have at least one $14 million app, but I think you can produce people who are more skilled, more intelligent, more able to make decisions, and I think that we should. We should be open to public and private ways of doing that work, and so on. So, you know, I think that, you know, I don't see in your description of what went on, what went on.
So I think there's, so on the one hand, right, I think there's all sorts of ways of making sort of late stage liberal capitalism more moral, and things that have been mentioned throughout the day. So something like, I think a full-scale stop to the drug war, right, would make and I think most people could probably agree with that, right, would make society a lot more moral. I think your question, though, has maybe something to do with something like the business side of capitalism, how to make the creative capacities of business, how to use them in a more moral way. And this phrase, conscious capitalism, is actually a really, I think, a pregnant phrase, right, because we normally think about capitalism as something that happens in a certain sense unconsciously, right, that the order is spontaneous because you don't plan it, right? I mean, that's kind of the whole point. So I guess I'm skeptical about our ability to foresee which kind of needs need to be met in the future, what kind of desires people are going to have, right? I mean, part of the deal with that kid's app is that 5 years ago, right, would you say, I'm going to make $14 million on an app? I would have looked at you and said, what is an app? I learned what an app was like last week. So, I mean, I'm skeptical about the idea that we can sort of bend the process of business to our desires in terms of making it more or less moral.
So in the interest of moving along in limited time, I'm going to ask for 3 questions from this side and then let the panel field all 3 at once. No, I mean, you can stay. We'll come to you, but go ahead. So.
Okay, yeah, sure. So we've been throwing around this term moral for this discussion, and to me it just seems like there's a little bit more depth to the term, if only because it has you know, a long etymology. And I'm curious more so, you know, not necessarily is capitalism moral, but how does this long tradition of morality fit into capitalism? And by that I mean to say, how are we defining morality in this sense? I mean, earlier we said, you know, the betterment of the general welfare, or the postponement of death. At one point we said, you know, it makes people live longer, and so therefore it's more moral. Is that how we're defining it in this day and age, or does it still have sort of the Christian connotation that would come along with it, or a religious connotation in a more broad sense? I'm curious how we're defining it.
So what is moral?
Yeah, well, in a very broad sense, what are we calling moral?
Thank you.
Hi, this question is mostly directed at Dr. Lamaski, but anyone on the panel can address it. Do you feel that the institutionalization of inequality and how it's compounded over time and the effects that it has on our children, born into a lack of equality of opportunity, do you feel that that can be reconciled with the American version of capitalism as it stands now? And are there immoral aspects of that lack of equality of opportunity? And if so, what can be done to reconcile that?
Thank you.
My question's more or less the opposite, and it's mostly for Professor Ryman. Given, as we established, that the extra money and capital that the rich have gives them greater influence over the government, is it possible to design a system that doesn't favor them as long as we're having any form of redistribution, given that they do have this increased influence over the government?
How do you want us to proceed?
Yeah.
However you want.
Why don't we defer to our junior colleague?
Does someone want to take up the moral question, the what is moral, and how does that fit into capitalism?
You know,
then you
I
can
mean,
go on to the one
answer
directed
might
to
take a little while since this is something I've been studying for 50 years, and I still haven't
You've got 30
reached a
seconds.
conclusion. But so I'll give you the shorter version, which is that we're using morality in a secular way. It generally has to do with what benefits people, what furthers their welfare, and what treats them fairly. Treating them fairly is a matter of treating them in a way that's compatible with believing that I think all human beings have a special kind of dignity. Therefore, inequalities have to be justified in terms that everybody could accept and so on. But, you know, like I say, there's a much longer answer, so be careful what you wish
And
for.
since you have the floor, do you want to answer the question directed at you?
Yeah, can we have a society that avoids favoring the rich? Well, I think there are things that we can do to avoid favoring the rich. I mean, for example, you know, I think the Citizens United decision that the Supreme Court made in recent years is a disaster. I think that it has opened the door even wider than it already was. It was already a pretty wide door to the influence of money on politics. I think we should probably have publicly funded campaigns and maybe even do away with contributions to campaigns. That would be a way of doing it, okay? If politicians did not have to pay large amounts of money for their campaigns, they would have much less need to get money from the rich. You know, the rich might still influence them, but it would be more like plain old bribes, which should be flat out illegal, rather than so-called contributions, because I know it costs you $1 zillion an hour to get on TV and so on. Okay, so I think it's not going to be perfect, but I think there are many things that you could do. You know, and I think some of the things that libertarians would like, you know, cut down some of government involvement. Well, the less government is doing, the less influence the rich can wield over it, and so on. So I think there are things that can be done to make this better, to make it tolerable. Many European countries have publicly financed campaigns. It has some effect.
In terms of what moral, I advise you to visit my class at UVA. I won't tell you there, but I'll let you raise questions. One man here, Jay Brennan, wrote a book called A Short History of Liberty. And that seems to me to give a big amount of this to stop screwing over other people in terms of religion, race, sex, and so all of this is pretty good stuff. There's more, but that's pretty central. In terms of these, I'm so happy that my dear friend Jack brought up Citizens United, because all my life, all my active life, it's been people on the left who will defend free speech, regardless. You wear a T-shirt saying the most vile obscenity, free speech. You do pole dancing, free speech. And these guys defend it. But corporations who are publishing things, expressing a view, maybe if CEOs did pole dancing, they'd support it. But they want to prohibit them from writing and speaking, and so I take it this shows us the complete bankruptcy of contemporary left liberalism. You see why I love this man so much.
Listen, I have to respond to this. This is just nonsense. First of all, I'm all for pole dancing. I'm all for pole dancing, and I'm for your right to wear it.
I've seen him do it.
Well, that's amateur, but it's true. Look, I'm all for your right to put whatever you want to say on your T-shirt, okay? And I'm for the right of corporations and corporate bosses to say what they want and to write what they want. The disagreement is about the use of money, and the reason for it, the reason it's different from pole dancing and different from t-shirts, it's that it's unequal. Okay? It means that a person like Bloomberg, who happens to be using his money for causes that I like, has unbelievable influence because he can use his billions to do this thing. Okay? It's not a matter of whether they can write. It's a matter of whether they can go on TV and make sure that what they say reaches 100 million people when everybody else can't. Okay? That's the objection. So don't allow the right to convince you that somehow the opposition to Citizens United is an opposition to free speech. They can speak and say what they want. What they can't do is use their billions to make sure that their opinion reaches so many more people than your opinions can reach.
Okay, let's take a couple more questions over here. So short, please, if you can.
Okay. Just, I have to say something about Citizens United. The problem about that has nothing to do with the speech issue. It's recognizing a corporation to give it privileges and immunities that have never been given to it before, and that are actually contrary to the idea of protecting corporations for individual contract. If they're going to have those rights,
Okay,
I would like to propose to marry Goldman Sachs, because my parents will be thrilled, it will be within the faith, and they'll be very happy. Okay, here's my questions. Number one, I'm a liberal who desperately wants to be a libertarian, but the only problem that I have is that it doesn't meet its own criteria of justice in acquisition and justice in transfer. I teach Western legal tradition here, and it was a shock to me when I first started teaching it how all this royalty that I respected were all horse thieves. And we know as a matter of fact that the real property that we're sitting on was not acquired with justice in acquisition or transfer. The Saxons didn't buy it from, the Normans didn't buy it from the Saxons, and the Normans who came here didn't buy it. So we know for a fact. Now, would you be willing to throw everything into the pot, redistribute it equally, and then have pure libertarianism? And then it would justify its own grounds. I wonder if you'd be willing to do that. Number two.
Okay. And this will be your last one.
And this will be my last one. I'm a capitalist desperately in search of capitalism. I used to work in Russia on their securities laws before I came here. And the one thing, there were all these Americans who were coming in to buy stock there, and I knew I would never buy that because you had no idea what your money, the stock, had to do with whatever else that corporation was doing. Now we have an agency, the SEC, that is consumer protection for the owners of capital. And it has been successively gutted since the Reagan administration. Would you be in favor of beefing up the SEC, which after all is designed to protect, as Adam Smith warned us about, designed to protect the owners against the managers?
Okay. Let's take one more, and then we'll honor our rule of three.
Okay, this question is directed at Professor Ryman. You talked about your redistribution. You said to give money to the poor that they deserve and to take money away from the rich that they don't deserve. On what grounds do they do or not deserve the money, and how do you measure that? And also you said how it's unfair that kids whose parents didn't do well don't have the opportunities of kids whose parents did do well. How is it fair to take the money away from the parents who did do well? How is that fair to the kids whose parents worked hard to give them a better opportunity to not have access to this money or opportunities?
Okay.
Okay.
You want to
Well, I'll respond to that one. For the guy, the liberal who wants to become a libertarian, I think that Lauren operates a 24-hour hotline. So I'll leave that to him. On the question of how determine what they deserve, we do not assume that wealth is deserved on the basis of personal virtue. Okay, the claim is in the case of what I was defending is that it's a matter of what the difference principle allows. Those inequalities which are necessary to maximize the share of of the worst off and everyone else above them, so to speak, that's the right amount in the sense that what is reasonable for all people taken together, okay? Now, there's a complicated argument for that, but that standard determines what people have a right to have and what they don't, okay? Now, the other question is the question of whether, of how it would be right to take money from the rich who've worked hard to be able to provide a good start for their children and give it to the poor to help their children. Against this, I would say, to this, I would say a couple of things. First of all, you don't have to have worked hard to have a lot of money. After all, you know, if you're not a founder of a firm, you may be an inheritor. All you have to do is own the coupons, own the stock certificates, okay? So let's not fall into the, you know, the illusion that every rich person, you know, worked their butt off and that's how they got it. Actually, Marx was quite sympathetic to the original capitalists, the ones who really did go from worker to capitalist. He was much more skeptical of the ones who inherited, and so on, okay? So let's talk about what's actually out there. The answer to the question, though, is that the inequality in the starting point is unfair from the get-go. That some children have the good sense to be born rich, and other children have the foolishness to be born poor, and therefore they're stuck with a life that's harder and more difficult, is simply not fair. So what we would do is try to improve the shares of the worst off, and we might have to take from the better off to do that. The better off will not be reduced to below what the poor were. You know, we would reach a point where hopefully we would have what's called equal opportunity. Remember that? Okay.
Okay, Lauren?
Very brief, and probably this isn't answering anything, but several times Jeff has said what we have to do is such and such. I would encourage those of you who are students or faculty, when you see the first person plural pop up, what is the word we referring to? But I will tell you right now, the we that well-meaning philosophers like the two of us, that's not the we who's going to be carrying the heavy artillery. Be real skeptical of the word we. Be skeptical of all these guys, especially people who want to throw everything into a big pot, redistribute it again. You know, that's been tried, actually. It's called making an omelet by breaking eggs. It's called Khmer Rouge, wanting to bring out a new system. We don't know how to do that. That's just, you know, okay for a thought experiment, maybe, but it's not a helpful anything.
So we have 4 other people waiting. Let's take all 4 at the same time, and then one last round from the panel. So let's start over here.
Perhaps this will prove to be more of an annoying question, or better for a whole nother topic for another conference. But it seems that we can cite incidences where capitalism or progress have been good. Gilded Age usually reflects that capitalism is not always the best thing. Currently, our culture is degenerated where our politicians, corporate leaders, and athletic superstars cheat. There's an increase in suicide, depression, anxiety, drug cartels, you name it. So I feel like the more appropriate question is, under the human condition, is a moral capitalism possible? Or more succinctly, is capitalism possible, since we seem to disagree on what capitalism is under Keynes, Hayek, Smith, you name it.
Okay, thank you.
I'm a big fan of the mindset of that which we cannot know anything for absolute certainty. And I think stemming from that, I sort of have to question all 3 of your positions on the fact that capitalism is the only theoretical system possible. I certainly agree with you guys in the fact that we are caged in the sense that at this point we only have the option of capitalism to choose from. But given that humanity is in the dawn of its existence, so to speak, I would argue, how can we say for absolute certainty that there is not a better system over the horizon? And is it not better to consider that it's possible?
Thank you.
So to start, I'm neither a Luddite nor a eco-terrorist, but I have two externalities to capitalism that I worry about were not addressed by the utilitarian argument that most of you guys put forward, saying, look, you know, things are still better. We'll qualify it other ways, but things are still better. My first question is, does capitalism have a larger project? If externalities, whether you get a pandemic, because we've been so good at producing, capitalism has been so good at producing antibiotics, it doesn't matter if, you know, cockroaches are the only thing left. And my other question about it would be, if technology does catch up and produces a world of total plenty, you know, we all worry about, to some extent, robots taking over our jobs. I mean, somebody brought up the recent purchase by Yahoo. That's a robot putting journalists, to some extent, out of their job. It's summarizing stuff, it's codifying everything. Does capitalism have an answer for us that is satisfying, or both of those so disruptive that, to the extent you saw it at the end of the industrial age, or at the dawn of the industrial age, do we have to come up with another philosophical project or another government project to move us and make capitalism something bigger than it is?
Thank you. And now the weighty burden of the last question.
So I think that all of you said that there are definitely some structural inequalities that exist in our society. For example, like just bigotry does exist, and there's sexism, racism, homophobia means that not everyone has an equal opportunity right now. But during the panel, which I really enjoyed, you seemed to often suggested that capitalism is a thing that is applied to society. So I was wondering, is capitalism applied to society, or is it integral to society? And if it's either way, what is the best way to address these structural inequalities in the system? Is it through capitalism as integral of society, or is it we'll disregard capitalism right now and just work with society and the inequalities in it? That's my question. Thank you very much.
Okay. Brandon, would you like
to? Yeah. So I guess to a couple things. So is capitalism the only system? I mean, it's the only system available right now. And so when I say that, I mean, I think it's the only system that the great majority, not only people in the US, but people around the world, the only system that the great majority of people would find acceptable, would find legitimate, right? So in terms of offering them, right, is there a system out in the future? Is there an ism in the future? Probably. I can't speculate on what it is. But nonetheless, in terms of if you offered people, right, you could have this mode of production, you have this one, right, you could move to a feudal age, you could do any of these things. I think the great majority of people would choose something like this. But to this question of does capitalism erode its, I guess, cultural, social base? I mean, it always has, right? And this was actually one of Marx's great insights, the idea of cultural contradictions, right? I mean, that capitalism has a way of eating itself. And I think a recent example of this would be something like, if you're on the internet, if you're around Slate and the Atlantic, you know that most 25-year-olds are suffering from like 21st century ennui, right? They don't know what to do with themselves. They can only find employment at coffee shops, right? They all appear on the show Girls, right? And they don't know what to do with themselves. And so do I think there's a problem? I think it is now, right? There's all sorts of issues, right? I mean, there's the purposive ethos, right? There's the Protestant ethic, right? Capitalism seems to have thrived on the idea that what work is what we're cut out for, labor is something that we should be doing, that we have a moral imperative to do these sorts of things. Will that be the case in the future? I don't know, right? If you can have a robot, make your bed for you and then do your job for you and all these sorts of things, will that make you unemployed? In a kind of obvious way, it will. Will that make you better off? I think in a similarly obvious way, I think it ultimately does, right? So, in other words, so if you look at something like the show Girls, right? Like the phenomena of somebody like Lena Dunham, right? Extraordinarily young, like she's like 25 or something like that. Completely brilliant. She's had access to, the best art in the world, the best literature that the world's ever produced. These things are available to everyone now. I mean, it doesn't get much better, right, than living a listless existence in Manhattan or something like that. So I think at some point we may be grumbling a bit too much about these things. At some point you might just need to be satisfied with less material wealth in the kind of traditional measures, and yet at the same time a lot more kind of cultural wealth.
Taking our classes and the hoops we put them through is a lot better than that boredom.
That's true.
Lauren?
Well, soon they'll take all of our classes online, so it won't make any difference.
Are you guys really suffering from 21st century ennui? If you are, would you stand up, please? Yeah, all right, I figured it was TV show. That was the plot of Sorrows of Young Werther, too. And, you know, it goes back a ways. I can't answer these deep questions, at least not in a little bit. I want to talk about robots. I think robots are wonderful. We ought to be real happy there are robots, because it's cool to say robot. We mean, you know, pretty advanced machines. But what do these do? What they do is automate tasks that are dull, repetitive, dangerous, and such. You are so lucky if you don't have one of these robot-type jobs. The person who asked it said he wasn't a Luddite. I was picturing in my head, you know, some guy here long ago said, I'm no Luddite, but, you know, the invention of this thing, the wheel, I'm worried about that, because here we are, we're carrying these stone hunks to the pyramids to build. What's the wheel going to do to it? I think you're damn fortunate that the technology toward which you're looking forward to in the next 50 years might be even greater than that of the past 50 years. So whether you're a Luddite or not, enjoy it, and not too much ennui.
I took down 4 questions. My answers are yes, no, better, and the latter. I'll now sum up mine.
Thank you very much.
That's all I have to say. Okay. Is moral capitalism possible for humans? Yes, but not a perfectly moral one. Okay. Is capitalism the only theoretically possible, the only theoretical system possible? Obviously not. The claim that was made up here was that it is currently the only system that's practically possible. Okay? That's to say, disaffection with socialism and communism is very, very widespread, and capitalism has been adopted even by some of the communist countries, which I think is quite a bit of testimony to its productive power. Can there be another system? Of course, this has nothing to do with absolute certainty. I mean, when someone tells me that there could be no absolute certainty, as a philosopher, I want to say, are you absolutely certain about that? Okay? And they are, okay? But they can't be because they've denied it. But the point is, it's not about absolute certainty. You know, I'm not certain about whether I'm going to make it home alive today. But I'm pretty certain, not absolutely, that socialism has produced stagnant economies and, you know, low standard of living, or at least frozen standard of living, and that most people around the globe have recognized that. Okay? So for that reason, I think at the moment and for the foreseeable future, capitalism is the only practical system possible. There are people ginning up theoretical systems around the clock. Read the work of John Romer. He's got 20 different versions of socialism. You know, I mean, so theoretical systems, I think, are infinite. About technology pulling people out of jobs, I agree completely with Lauren. I think, imagine a world where nobody had to work in a coal mine. Can you imagine how, have any of you ever been in a coal mine? The closest I was in Chicago in the museum. They have a coal mine. It's dark and dirty, and you know, you don't see the light all day, and there's accidents. I think it would be great if technology took those jobs away, okay? You know, what this will mean is, hopefully, they will be replaced by jobs that take more brain power, more originality, more creativity, and so on. Where they're not, they'll have to be replaced with less work, okay? That's what Marx foresaw, was that capitalism would what he's called replace living labor with dead labor. That's to say, laborers with machines. And that ultimately, that would lead to us having more free time, being able to do more of the things we want. If that's what happens, that's fine with me, okay? Is capitalism applied to society or integral to society? I've got to tell you, I don't really understand what that means. This won't stop me from answering it, of course. I assume it's integral to society because it seems so much a part of our daily life. I don't see how you could separate it. And if the question is, should we somehow deal with bigotry by dealing just with the society and not with capitalism? Well, that ain't going to happen because capitalism is all over the place. Remember that most people work most of their waking adult lives in some capitalist enterprise, okay? So capitalism is not just something you can say, well, let's, you know, except for capitalism, we'll fix this problem. You know, that ain't going to happen.
Do any of the panelists have an overall last concluding thought?
I'm impressed as hell by this audience here, and the fact that you come here when, you know, in this city there's so many things you could be doing. I can only guess. I can only guess that somebody paid you off big time.
Well, you stole part of my thunder, but so let me wrap up by thanking the three of you for an excellent presentation. It was a very spirited and illuminating conversation.
Despite your terrible question.
I know. It's, so even in capitalism, bad people can do okay sometimes. I'd like to thank the other panelists who performed today, some of you who are still out there. I'd like to thank my Political Theory Institute colleagues, Tom Merrill, Borden Flanagan, Brandon Turner, with whom I had infinite conversations in trying to plan this. I'd like to thank Lizzie Martinez, standing in the back of the room, who did all of the behind-the-scenes practical work, that logistical work that made this happen. And lastly, I also would like to thank the audience. You know, we all have worked long and hard on this, and for the last 2 weeks I've been saying to anybody who would listen to me, I'm never doing a conference like this again, because it was just so hard, and I was terrified that no one would show up. But almost all day long, we had over 100 people in the room. And so I thank you for your intellectual curiosity and for coming out today, really.